Okay. So this first week, this is all about biotensegrity and respiration biases. So this is going to serve as kind of like the primer. And biotensegrity, if you guys have ever heard of it, it's kind of it's been around for a while, but it's also something that not a lot of people know about. It's really this theory about how everything is made up of smaller things. The idea of like as above, so below. So really, when nature finds something that is very successful or it works, it's just going to repeat it on various levels of complexity. There's a book, I've got it over here. If you guys want more information on this type of theory, I'd recommend you check out this book right here. This is a fantastic read and it goes into much more detail than I'm going to go into today, but this is still just a brief overview. So just going to let a couple more people in and let's get rolling. So today we're going to appreciate the role of the biotensegrity theory and how it relates to the human body. We're going to appreciate how this feeds into rib cage, diaphragm, and sacral mechanics, and then determine the fundamental and anatomical differences between expansion and compression. These words we hear on Instagram all the time, right? We actually want to define those and understand them. And then effectively utilize the limb arc model to determine the needs of a given client. So this is going to serve as our framework for the upcoming 12 weeks. All right, biotensegrity. So nature wants to follow the path of least resistance. That's just efficiency because we want to spend the least amount of calories or energy units for the most amount of given results. So that's why, generally speaking, that's going to be a straight line. It's not always the case, but a lot of the times it is going to be a perfectly straight line. Now, if you take an efficient structure made up of straight lines, according to people who are way better at math than me, a triangle is a representation of that in 2 dimensions. In 3 dimensions, that's going to be a pyramid. In 4 dimensions, that's a tetrahedron. So you can see the pyramids. Sorry, if I just pause, I'm letting people in the room. If you see these images right here, look at A. A is made up of pyramids, but then you can start to get into 4D once you get into like letter C. But if you notice, if you stack pyramids together, it doesn't matter how wide or how narrow you do it, you're going to get a helix every single time. That's going to be important. So this was taken out of a 1985 anatomy textbook, and I'm not sure they even knew what they were doing. But look at myosin, look at actin, look at tropomyosin. What are they forming? They're forming helixes. So ultimately, everything is just being made up of different variations and forms of helixes. They probably weren't aware of the biotensegrity theory because back then this wasn't really a thing, but it was just kind of like floated out there. But just studying this image, I think is fascinating because really we think of these things as like lines, but no, they're helixes, they're double helixes. So really it goes back to that sort of Eastern saying of as above, so below. We're just made up of a lot of this stuff. And it's really all about managing tension. You guys ever seen one of these toys before? Most people have. So this toy is expanding and compressing around an invisible central fixed point. So if you were to take out one of these, I don't know, one of those plastic things that expands and contracts within it that's made up of, this whole structure would be compromised. So everything is trying to maximize the amount of tension it can spread out throughout the structure. We're trying to be the most efficient we possibly can be. This is really how it works within the visual sense of this structure, but also human beings. So really it's like, how can we spread stress across our body in the most efficient manner? Cells do this. You might look at a cell and it looks kind of like a blob, like that cell on the left right there. It doesn't look like there's anything strategic going on with it, right? But what that cell is doing is it's responding to chemical signals from other cells as well as tension based on perceived lines of stress. This is called mechanotransduction. Fascia acts this way and muscles act this way because we're just made up of a bunch of cells. If you look at the thing on the right, that looks like a cell with a nucleus, but I also think that looks like an atom. I don't really have any scientific papers to back that one up, but I just think it's an interesting theory. So if you take, let's go back to this guy right here. Look at letter A. Now, let's look at this right here. Do you see that those two things aren't that different? This is just helixes working together to form tubes. And tubes are everywhere in our body: blood vessels, muscles, fascia, bones. So regardless of whether this structure expands or contracts, tension is always increasing. So we might think of muscles as if they contract like this and then expand like that, but really it's this, it's that. Contract, expand, wind, unwind. And again, according to people that are really good at math and in this theory, the optimal angle at a resting helical angle is 54.44 degrees. They rounded it up to 55 here. To be honest with you, I don't know the math behind it, but I trust them. So now to make this a little bit more anatomically specific, let's look at these two structures right here, the elbow and the knee. So look at this knee right here. I think that's the one that kind of like shows this idea of a tension network of cables. Do you see that if you were to study this image really, really closely, and hopefully that AC unit's not too loud, that just went on, nothing I can do about it. So if it's too loud, can you guys hear that? Okay. I'll see if I can do something about that later. But if you were to take one of these lines out right here, do you guys see that this whole structure would be compromised? So for example, you got a quad tear, you might have a hamstring strain. Where is that tension going to go? If you take tone out of something, you got to put tone back in. So that's what this whole system is trying to do: redistribute the stress across this whole system. And if you study this knee really carefully, you might think you see lines, but I see a lot of triangles. And obviously with the elbow, you see a ton of triangles as well. And that's how the muscles pull. These bones aren't actually touching. These bones are suspended by this network of cables, ligaments, muscles, fascia, etc. So why does any of this matter? Well, every muscle is triplanar. Nothing is acting in isolation. Obviously, if we looked at the elbow and knee right there, and changes in one part of the body will influence distal structures via lines of stress. As we try to take tone out, via an injury or whatever, we got to put tone back in. So there's only two choices. There's expansion, which I define as external rotation, abduction, and flexion. And there's compression, which is internal rotation, adduction, and extension. So whenever you hear these two words, I want you to think of those joint actions. Now, given this sort of background we now have on biotensegrity, let's now integrate some principles. That AC unit is exceptionally loud today. I'm sorry, guys. So the first thing we're going to talk about is structure dictates function. Alex Effer uses this analogy with the syringes, and I think it's really good, so I stole it from him. So shape and size is going to determine what the structure can do and how it manages pressure. So I'm someone who has a wide structure, so I can output that pressure quickly, and that's going to be more associated with an anaerobic environment. Someone who's more narrow framed, like imagine a thin marathon running female, that person is going to have low pressure, but slower and longer output. So they're not going to be able to do it as quickly, but they're going to do it for a longer time with less relative compression. There's a thing out there called Boyle's Law, and Boyle's Law basically just says things compress as they get closer together. What does that sound like? Well, that's just exhalation. So as these molecules get packed closer together, that allows them to then compress more for obvious reasons, if you look at this image right here. But that's why exhalation is a force producing strategy. If we inhale on the concentric of a heavy deadlift, that's probably not going to go too well. And that's for this reason. We need to compress and get things to come together. So ultimately, the body works in an alternating and reciprocal fashion. So when we do a barbell squat, we're teaching the body to do the same thing on both sides at the same time. Nothing wrong with that inherently, but I think it's important to appreciate that we also have expansion going on one side, compression going on the other, depending on where we are in gait, depending on where we are within a movement. A good rule of thumb with gait is whatever is happening on one side of the body, the opposite is usually happening on the other. Keep that in mind. So respiration is movement. We move so much within our body when we breathe. When we inhale, that's that expansion. Our ribs are going to externally rotate. We're going to see abduction and flexion throughout our body. That includes the pelvis and the rib cage and the shoulders. Exhalation is going to be associated with compression. We're going to go into more internal rotation, adduction, and extension. That doesn't mean like it's always black and white, like we're always going to be internally rotating if we're producing force. We generally are, but there are circumstances in where external rotation is also heavily involved within force production. So just keep that in mind. And now let's get into some biomechanics. So those are the principles. That's what everything is built upon. Now, in terms of the actual mechanics, I think we're all familiar with this thing called the diaphragm. It has two main roles, inhalation and stabilization. So the concentric action is when it descends. That's when we take a breath in through our nose. As we exhale, it's going to become eccentric. It should ascend, but it can also be a stabilizer. And you guys will read about this in your reading this week from that book, Recognizing and Treating Breathing Disorders. So stabilization is going to be really important. The diaphragm has, as we'll talk about in the coming weeks, big, thick, meaty attachments, especially on the right side of our spine, to stabilize it. So when we take a big breath in and we do that Valsalva maneuver, like a 1-rep max squat, we are going to use that diaphragm as a muscle of stabilization for our spine rather than inhalation, because we inhale, it's concentric, and then we hold it there, and then we go into the hole. Rib cage mechanics, we have two different types. We have our upper ribs and we have our lower ribs. Generally speaking, our upper ribs are being defined as the pump handle ribs. This is ribs 1 through 7, and this is going to operate like a pump handle, meaning the pump handle goes forward as we inhale and it comes backward as we exhale. As we go lower than that, beyond rib 8, that's going to be bucket handle. So think about it like transverse diameter. Think about it like inhaling, swinging out, inhaling, swinging back, or exhaling, swinging back in. Whereas pump handle is just more anterior to posterior. These lower ribs right here of the bucket handle also do not have as strong attachments as the pump handle ribs. And that's also going to matter later. In terms of the sacrum, it has two main roles. It can nutate and it can counter-nutate. So nutation is technically flexion of the sacrum. Counter-nutation is extension of the sacrum. Inhalation is going to be associated with that counter-nutation. The innominate are going to go into relative amounts of flexion, external rotation. Upon exhalation, it's the very opposite. We're going to see nutation and then extension, internal rotation. We all on the same page so far? Femoral mechanics. So I like to think of the femur as a follow and the pelvis as the lead. If you guys ever done a swing dance before or seen a swing dance, the pelvis is the lead and the femurs are the follow. So the femurs are going to be dictated by the pelvic position. It feeds down the chain. So when our pelvis comes forward, bring up the model here, for an anterior orientation of the pelvis, whether that's chronically or just acutely, that's going to open up room for us to get internal rotation. And then that should feed down into tibial internal rotation and then therefore pronation. That's normal. In terms of a posterior orientation of the pelvis, you'll see how that opens up room for external rotation. Then down the chain into supination. This is normal. It's okay if our knees come in when we're producing force and internally rotate. It's, can our knees come in? Can we go into femur and tibial internal rotation and then couple that with good pronation? But it starts at the pelvis and it works its way down. We have problems when we have femoral internal rotation and tibial external rotation with foot supination. That's when things start to break down. Now to cover some basic inhalation mechanics. So inhalation is letter B right here. That's the guy on the right. So we're going to have upper cervical extension, lower cervical flexion. Thoracic kyphosis is going to overall decrease. You could argue that there are some parts of the thorax that increase and decrease to relative amounts, but overall you're going to see a decrease. There's going to be a counter-nutation of the sacrum and the scapula is going to go inward into external rotation, abduction, downward rotation, posterior tipping. I don't really care if you guys know this right now. This is just a very broad overview that we're going to be talking about for the next 3 weeks. So just understand that this slide is just sort of a review. As we exhale, we're going to go into upper cervical flexion, lower cervical extension, thoracic kyphosis increases overall, nutation of the sacrum, which leads to increased lumbar lordosis, and the scapula is going to go outward. The scapula goes outward because it tries to almost wrap around the rib cage to squeeze the air out of this. You can think of it like that. Okay, now let's get into respiratory biases. I'm sure you guys, if you're taking this course, you're at least familiar with the idea of an infrasternal angle. But just to review it, it's the most pliable bones and structure within our axial skeleton. So this is representative of an individual's respiratory strategy. It's representative of the compensation, not what's actually going on originally. And I'll explain what that means in a second. So it's just this angle right here. And in the readings and suggested videos for this week, Bill Hartman is going to take you guys through a video on how you can measure this effectively. So we're going to get much more into the weeds of wide ISAs, narrow ISAs, all that stuff. But this week is just a very basic primer. I'm trying to not make things too complicated right off the bat. So with a wide ISA, you're going to have expanded infrasternal ribs. These people are going to be pushing air forward a lot. They're going to have a posterior rib cage that is compressed. So they're compressed back there, so the air's got to go forward. When the air goes forward, what happens? Well, then this spreads out because I'm pushing everything forward. Generally speaking, I'm going to call this above about 110 degrees. That's what I'm looking for when I see a wide ISA. Their sacrum is going to be nutated, which causes, if you remember the pelvis and femoral mechanics, that's going to cause an internal rotation bias within the femurs. And then that's going to feed down the chain. These people often have that military kind of posture like you see on the right here. So because of this forward orientation of the sacrum, could you guys see that as that comes forward? You're going to have to counterbalance yourself out somehow. So if this is going forward, you're gonna have to swing back up top in order to fight gravity and manage it and stay upright. So you'll often see an increase in thoracic kyphosis with these individuals. A narrow ISA is going to have compressed infrasternal ribs anteriorly. Their diaphragm and pelvic floor is really descended. And we'll get into why in a second here, but their posterior rib cage is expanded. So this is going to be usually in thinner individuals and females. Imagine a spectrum from like a big, wide powerlifting male to a small, thin marathon running female. Everyone is generally within that spectrum somewhere, but those are the two extremes and can give you an idea of where most people are at. Generally, you can look at someone visually and tell what they are just by intuition, but I would always encourage you guys to measure unless it's just glaringly obvious. But measuring is important because you will be surprised from time to time. So with these people, they have a counter-nutated sacrum where this comes back like that. Do you see how that would lead to more of a flat back orientation? So these people, and you see this all the time, like think about if you guys ever worked with young females before. They have those flat backs because that's where they're biased to originally, and they're not old enough to have compensated out of it yet. So just think about those kinds of individuals you work with, and then this starts to make a lot more sense. And obviously they're gonna have an external rotation bias at the femurs. So with their diaphragm, what's happened is generally, so for wides, for example, they have a descended diaphragm, right? But with a narrow, it's so far descended because usually the fibers of the diaphragm are relatively vertical. Now, what tends to happen is as it descends more and more, those fibers become more horizontal. And I used to actually think that it was the pull of the diaphragm on the rib cage that caused this sucking inward and upward action, but it's actually the pressure gradient within the thorax. That's what's actually causing this. The pressure changes because of the dissension, which results in that pooch belly look. And if you guys want to read more about that, I'll cite my source in the readings for this week. So that is what you see right here on the left. The beer belly is what you see on the right. This is just like, it looks like they got a basketball in their belly, right? And of course, there's a fat component to these things, but also it's being driven by what's going on within their genetic bias. So if you couple a pooch belly with an anterior pelvic tilt, you could see how it would look like there's a big buildup of potentially fat there, but is that really the case? Well, it depends, right? I don't think we should be going around telling people you just need to breathe better and you'll look better in your stomach, right? I think it's important to be like, okay, what's going on with your visceral fat? What's going on with your breathing? And what's going on with your skeletal position? Those things will give you the answer. The infrapubic angle. So in normal respiration, in normal circumstances, we should see this be the inverse of the ISA. So think about it like this. When we inhale, ISA comes apart, and then we go into counternutation within our sacrum. So this angle closes. So it would be the inverse. But when we're stuck in these biases, we tend to have the same. So a wide infrasternal angle individual who's biased towards more compression within their pelvis is going to have a wide infrapubic angle. And then the same thing is going to go for the narrow. So this is important because we're talking about the pelvic floor here. So if I'm narrow, my pelvic floor is in a more descended position like this. So imagine a trampoline. The trampoline is just drooped. For me, I'm a wide, so I'm here. My pelvic floor is spread apart. So it's hard for me to get my guts and all this pressure to descend upon inhalation. I like to push it forward, which also then feeds into my ISA getting bigger over time. And now here's the main course for today. This is the limb arc model. Now, I'm sure you guys have seen something like this before. If you haven't, don't worry about it. I'm going to explain it in some detail right now. So this is originally Bill Hartman's idea. I'm almost certain. This is kind of like taken from his model, right? So if you're ever wanting to learn more about these things, go check out his YouTube videos. Dude's really, really smart. So from 0 to 60 degrees, we're talking about flexion here. Imagine a squat. This is the easiest way to explain it to people. But usually when I'm talking about the limb arc model, I'm talking about shoulder flexion or I'm talking about hip flexion. So let's just imagine a squat for the purposes of simplicity. So from 0 to 60 degrees of hip flexion, that's correlated with heel strike. And we'll talk about that more next week. But 0 to 60 degrees, when I start descending into the hole in a squat, this is a flexion, abduction, external rotation, plantar flexion, and supination bias within my lower body. So this is going to be associated with that inhalation phase, right? But as we approach 90 degrees of hip flexion, internal rotation is being maximized. So that's going to be more of that exhalation mechanics. This is internal rotation, extension, adduction. Why do someone's knees cave in on a squat in the sticking point, which is around 90 degrees? Well, maybe they don't have internal rotation and that's how they're trying to find it. Beyond that, we go and do 120 to 180. This is more late stance. This is going to be more inhalation and expansion capabilities once again. But if you guys watch someone squat really deep who has the ability to do so, their knees actually move back into more relative amounts of plantar flexion. So you need less dorsiflexion to squat deeper. But also in terms of hip flexion, it's impossible to get 180 degrees. It's not going to happen. So really you're going to tap, most people are going to tap out around 120. But it's still, I like to say you're generally going to enter that in the deepest portion of a squat. So let's take another couple of examples here. So if we're bench pressing all the time, I'm a wide ISA. If I bench press too much, my shoulders act up. It's inevitable. It doesn't matter how good my form is. And the reason for that is because I am someone biased towards internal rotation, adduction, and extension. And I am putting internal rotation, adduction, and extension, pronation of my forearms, and I'm just overloading my body with that over and over again. So if I do that enough times, then I'm probably going to tweak something because I'm just overloading my system with certain joint actions. Why is it that when I do a neutral grip dumbbell bench press, I feel better? That's because I'm just giving myself what I don't have. Another example, why would a narrow infrasternal angle, you guys ever work with young females and they really struggle to hinge? They really struggle to not round their low back. Well, what does a hinge require? Generally around 90 degrees of hip flexion, right? That's when the sacrum should be nutated. So they need to flex their sacrum. Remember, this is flexion. So if they're in this counter-nutated state with a flat back and they can't find flexion within their sacrum and they can't compress to get in that nice hinge position, they're going to find flexion one joint higher at their low back. Another example would be, why do I struggle to not hinge my squat? Well, that's because my sacrum's forward and I can't find the counter nutation and the relative motion within my pelvis to then drop ass to grass very nicely. So I hinge my squat. If I were to go deeper, I would butt wink, because that would be my attempt in finding that counter nutation. Hopefully that's making sense. So just to give you guys a little bit of evidence to support this model here. So internal rotators, abductors, like the anterior glute med, like your adductor magnus, all of these muscles have the most leverage to work in internal rotation at 90 degrees of hip flexion. That would be when your thighs parallel the floor in a squat. The piriformis switches its moment arm to internal rotation at 90 degrees of hip flexion. So we always think of the piriformis as an external rotator. It's actually not always the case. And hamstring's optimal length tension relationship is at 90 degrees of hip and knee flexion. Why do we do 90-90 hip lifts? There you go. That's why. All right, now let's get into a little bit of other stuff as it relates to these biomechanics here. So this slide I think is massively important. I've had this slide in for as long as I've been doing this. I just can't get rid of it because this slide matters so much. I think this is probably the most important slide in the entire presentation. So if we've got someone who has a weak glute med, we might think, all right, let's give you some mini band side steps. That sounds like a great idea. But to me, I call that mindless activation reps, because what they're trying to say with giving someone that exercise, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, they're saying, I want to facilitate the activation of this muscle. And if I do that enough times, that's going to change my pelvic position, hopefully. And then if I do that enough times, then hopefully my brain will adapt to that and go, okay, I can survive here. I can live here. But in my opinion, it works the exact opposite of that. I think that the brain has selected a skeletal position that it feels comfortable in, given the movement options, the injury history, morphology, all of these things, which then feeds into what the muscles can do, because skeletal position drives muscular function. That's something I think most of us are aware of by now. So we also want to think about references as it relates to gait. I don't know if you guys saw my Instagram post about training the glute med, but why would we do mini band side steps when, let's say, you're probably working the abductor fibers, right? So that would be more of the posterior glute med. That would be associated in gait with hip extension and that toe off. So we would be on our big toe. But we're doing mini band side steps in hip flexion, and we're having outside foot reference, and there's no carryover to gait there. So for me, I don't see the value of doing an exercise like that compared to other things potentially. So where is the foot being used? When is the foot being used, and what muscles are associated? What skeletal positions are being associated with it? We'll get into that stuff a ton more next week. And we also, if we want to have a change occur within the body, we need to breathe through it. We could do the most perfect, for example, just 90-90 hip lift in the entire world, but if we're not breathing through it, we're probably not going to be using our time very well. So when we breathe and we can control our breath, that is essentially activating the parasympathetic rest and digest branch of our nervous system. If we're very shallow and we're very tense, we're treating it like a max strength exercise, then that's going to make us sympathetic. And why would our body want to adapt to something that's a threat? The reason why our sympathetic system gets activated is because our body is saying, oh, this could potentially not be good for my survival. I need to do something about this. Whereas parasympathetic is a non-threatening environment. So we need to allow the brain to let go and make changes. So going back to that very basic example, a wide infrasternal angle individual in a 90-90 hip lift would probably benefit from reaching down. Why? Because that's in more of that inhalation zone. The bucket handle is going to be down more so, and you're going to allow the obliques to kick on more here in this position, because that downward reach helps facilitate that ribs down. For a narrow ISA, I'd have them reach up, and we'll get into why that reach is good for getting expansion anteriorly in a couple of weeks. But for now, hopefully you guys just looking at the Lemhardt model, you can kind of understand why they would probably want to reach in this position, assuming no secondary compensations. And honestly, I'm not the biggest 90-90 hip lift guy in the world. This is just a really easy exercise that I think most people are aware of, where you can see the carryover here. So when we do breathing through quote unquote corrective exercises, again, I don't use that term unless I'm talking to coaches, because people know what I'm talking about. But when I talk to my clients, I don't use the word corrective exercise, because I think that implies that we're trying to correct them and what they're doing is not right. So when we have a narrow ISA, I want them to fog the glass to ensure their obliques don't excessively take over. It's okay if they get a little bit of abs, it's not the end of the world, but if they're really feeling heavy compression within their obliques, that's probably not going to be the best thing for them. We want them to open their mouth, big open sigh, as they exhale. Wide ISAs are more forceful. I like to say blow out your birthday candles. But both cases of these people need to get all the air out. So they could exhale like this and then think they're done, but they need to get as much as they can out in a comfortable manner, because that is what's going to help their diaphragm ascend. And that's what's going to help them get expansion upon the inhalation where they're going for, based off of the constraints of the exercise. So proper breathing guidelines. Let's all do this together right now. Go ahead and link your hands like this and put them on your low ribs. Sit up nice and tall. Feel your heels on the ground. And now what I want you to do is relax your belly. A lot of people you guys are going to work with have rectus strategies, meaning that they're going to want to exhale and feel their six-pack abs. I cue a jelly belly to make sure that's not the case. So relax your stomach completely. Now exhale all the air out of your mouth, depending on what ISA you are, but don't lose height in your skeleton as you do it. So go. Now I've got my obliques. I'm out of air. And then relax, but keep that tension in your obliques to a slight degree, depending on your ISA. Pause, and then inhale through your nose. If you do it right, you're going to feel a ton of expansion happening within your rib cage, hopefully. I will also say this. People are really good at exhaling strong if you cue them to. But I would much rather have someone exhale for a very long time in a relaxed manner rather than exhaling really hard for a short amount of time or even a long time. Because try this, go back to that, put your hands on your low ribs. Now exhale like you're blowing out your birthday candles really aggressively. You're gonna feel your six-pack abs. So we just wanna make sure that that's not happening. It's not the worst thing ever. I don't wanna demonize it, but if we're trying to get respiration mechanics, we want our obliques to be working, specifically internal obliques. Okay, now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through a 90-90 hip lift drill together. And I want you guys to pay attention to the words and language I'm going to use when I do this, because I think the 90-90 hip lift is a good exercise. I think it's a little boring, but I also think it's a good, very basic starting position. So let's all hop down on the floor and let's go through it. I'll coach you guys through it. So you want your hips and knees obviously at a 90-degree angle. You want to feel your heels firmly on that wall. If you have socks on, it might be a little bit hard. You might want to take your socks off. All right, now I'm sure you guys have probably coached one of these before, but in my experience, this is one of those activities where people will kind of start to half-ass it as they get better and better at it, because they lose intention, which is normal. And again, why I'm not the biggest fan of this type of activity, but let's just use this as a primer, which is going to feed into the next weeks. So feel your heels firmly on that wall. Your whole foot is flat. So step one is do a posterior pelvic tilt. So I want you to imagine there's a bug underneath your low back. I want you to squish that bug and then feel your heels firmly on that wall. I want you to pull down on the wall with your heels while crushing that bug and getting your hips slightly off of the ground. That should engage your hamstrings. Now reach at an angle that is respective to your ISA. If you don't know your ISA, just reach down. And make sure that your pecs are staying off. People will have a really hard time, especially wides, with keeping their pecs off. And now you should feel your hamstrings. And now give me a nice, relaxed, long exhale through your mouth, respective to your ISA, and then pause. When you pause with your mouth closed, it's not your need for oxygen, it's your need for releasing CO2 building up. So that's really why we need to get people to pause in between the exhale and the inhale. Try two different types of breaths right now. So I want you to do one exhale where you exhale all the air out and you don't pause and you inhale right after that. And then do another one where you exhale and then pause for 3 to 5 seconds with your mouth closed and then inhale. You'll find the expansion on the second one is dramatically better. And that's because you're slowing down, you're allowing your body to down-regulate a little bit, and then you're also increasing your ability to tolerate CO2, which then feeds into more parasympathetic input. All right, how was that? Thumbs up, thumbs down? All right. So to cite my sources, these are all people I got a lot of this information from. PRI, Bill Hartman, Zach Couples, and Alex Effer are all people that I've learned a lot of this stuff from. So I wanted to give them credit where credit is due. I will be linking a lot of these materials within the website. So you'll see the YouTube video, and then you'll see the suggested readings, and then you'll see the ebooks on a different section. So I want you guys this week to read pages 11 through 21 within this book right here. The ebook is on the site, so you don't need to buy it or anything. And then watch these videos right here. This article that I linked about the narrow ISA's diaphragm is a real, it's a read, but it's also a good one if you have the patience for it. So just a couple housekeeping things here. With your small groups, I put you guys in small groups, and if you requested to be in a group with someone, you should be there. If not, please let me know. And if you're not in a small group, it's probably because I have not seen your entry on the Google form. So I would encourage you guys to meet after this call sometime throughout the week, and then review the study guide, which I'll show you guys in a second. Review any material, discuss any general questions you may have, and coach each other through exercises and get to know each other. I've had a lot of people make just pretty good friends, good networking connections. So this is a really important part of it. If you don't want to participate in the small groups, I mean, that's your choice. But I will say that the people that get the most out of this program, they get out what they put in, if that makes sense. In the Slack chat, we have a couple of different channels. Program updates. This is just me posting anything important that I feel like you guys need to see right away. Questions. This is for you guys to post anything you want, like have at it. You guys can answer each other's questions. You guys can have chats. You can post any case studies that you may have, questions about a client, feel free. And random is just quite literally random, whatever you want, anything off topic or just not related to the questions or program updates. And then resources, that's also, I'm going to probably post some things in there. If you guys have like a video you want to share, for example, from someone, or you have, I don't know, a book you want some people to read, link it there in resources. And then I'm going to show you guys a study guide right here. So this is what it's going to look like pretty much every week in terms of like the format. And what we're looking for here is I selected specifically these questions because I think if you can answer these questions confidently, or at least you get along the right lines, then this is what's going to pretty much tell you that you have a good understanding of everything I want you to have an understanding of. So in the review session, which I will be posting a straw poll to see what time works best for the most people, we will be reviewing this every single week. We will be talking about any questions you might have from your small groups. And that'll be about a 45-ish minute meeting. But again, I'm not really too picky on how long that goes. So with that being said, do you guys have any questions? Glute med won't be working during heel strike or mid stance. Do you mean, so I'm trying to like understand entirely what you're asking there. Just, I'll tell you when the glute med works. So when we are in mid stance, and we're gonna go over this so much more next week. When we're in mid stance, the pelvis shifts over the femur and the anterior glute med is working to resist your pelvis moving excessively into abduction. If your glute med doesn't work very well, then you see like a Trendelenburg sign where you're here and then you just get like this big drop, big old drop. And that's usually a weakness of the glute med, but it's also a lot more than that. So I think it's not fair to pin it entirely on the glute med. And in terms of late stance, it's going to be working. It's going to be working as a slight amount of abduction as we toe off. In heel strike, I think it's more eccentric than anything else. Are we going to be talking about asymmetric? Yes, for sure. That's coming next week and the week after. How does rib flare correlate with ISA? So if we're talking just anterior lower rib flare, it's going to you're still going to get the ISA measurement that you're probably looking for. I will say though, when you see someone with a lot of rib flare, getting them on their back can be a better way of measuring it. But if you're online, that's really, really tough. Honestly, online measurements are ridiculously hard for a lot of people. So I think getting people on their back is a good way to go for that. But if someone has a rib flare, they're probably just an anterior pelvic tilt. That's what that tells me. So we'll get into a lot more nitty gritty details next week with the pelvis, but you can be a narrow with an anterior pelvic tilt. You can be a wide with an anterior pelvic tilt. You can be a left AIC who's a narrow with an anterior pelvic tilt. You could be a wide left AIC, anterior pelvic tilt. It's all just relative to where you're starting from. Is it common for narrow ISAs to exhibit hyperextended knees in the anatomical state? Yeah, I think so. I think I see that quite a bit. And I think, again, if you think about your younger female clients, a lot of the times they do have that hyperextension within their knee because they have that external rotation bias. And generally speaking, they're also someone who loves to have an anterior pelvic tilt. So when that happens, they oftentimes hyperextend their knees to find a more neutral center of mass. So they're not going forward so much. Connor, for the exhale, are you okay with exhaling through your nose instead of your mouth? Yeah, I am. If that is something I will use in the context of they can't exhale and not feel their rectus. So if that's the case, then I'll probably cue an exhale through the nose, but it just takes longer, And I think if we're trying to have it be specific to training, weight training, or just athletics in general, exhaling through the mouth is probably going to be a little bit more specific to that. But yeah, you definitely could. You mentioned the hip influences structures down the chain. Was wondering what your take is on the foot influencing the pelvis. Yes. I think, you can't look at one without the other, top down, bottom up, like they're both right. And I think Gary does a really good job of explaining those concepts. And we will get into looking at the feet and how that's going to then feed up the chain into the pelvis. But I think just for learning purposes, it makes a lot of sense. And it's easier for people to understand how the top down approach works first. I get a lot of tension in my lower back during the 90-90 hip lift. I would say I'm a wide ISA with anterior pelvic tilt. So I think it would depend on the compensation that you're in. And we'll get into compensatory patterns. But if you are someone who is really, really compressed, the 90-90 hip lift is not the best option for you probably. You would probably want to be more of a sideline position, sideline 90-90 hip lift. Simply because, again, the influence of gravity, I've seen a lot of people do really, really good 90-90 hip lifts and they can't breathe during that position because gravity's pushing down on them and spreading them out laterally like they already are. So if we get them sideline, that presses them laterally and then they get more anterior to posterior expansion. They don't have to stress and then potentially harm their low back. But I would be curious, Rich, if you were feeling your hamstrings during that activity too and where in your hamstrings you were, because that could give me some insights too. If we could take away one main aspect from this presentation, what would you hope it to be? Great question. The limb arc model for sure. If you guys have any questions on the limb arc model, please let me know. I'd be happy to go over it again. But that's the main takeaway I want you guys to get from this. Does the ISA and lower ribs change structurally through intervention? Yeah, that's a really good question, right? So can you make a wide more narrow and a narrow more wide? I think so to a degree, but you're never going to see you're never going to see like crazy permanent increases because that's the underlying thing. That's their genetics, right? It's like, how much are you going to take someone who is biased towards being an exceptional marathon runner and get them super jacked and make them a power lifter? Probably it's like, that's kind of a fair comparison for that. But ultimately, yes, you can definitely see change, especially in younger people. I had a younger kid last month and his ISA was so narrow. After 2 weeks, I think his ISA like increased 20 degrees and it was just staying there. But he was also what, 14 years old or something like that. So both narrow and wide ISAs can have anterior pelvic tilt for sure. Yeah, it's just different depending on how they get there. Generally speaking, and this goes into the compensation patterns. So a narrow, they're here, they get pushed forward by their back extensors. So they tend to do this. They tend to just go forward as an absolute unit. Wides are already sort of biased towards an anterior pelvic tilt originally. But as they compress more and more, what ends up happening is they just get pulled forward by their adductors. They get pulled forward by their hip flexors. If you guys saw my guide to anterior pelvic tilt, the ebook, I talk about anterior and posterior compression. I'm talking about the musculature. So narrows are more oftentimes going to have things pushing them forward from the back into anterior pelvic tilt. Wides are going to have stuff more likely on the front of the pelvis, pull them into anterior pelvic tilt. Will articles be posted in Slack today? Yes, they will. They will be in the resources section. When testing limb arc model, how picky does it need to be when looking for deviations to compensate and make sure you are staying in the right range? I think that would depend on the exercise that you're using. James, could you clarify what you mean, like deviations in the context of what? I think that would matter for that. But I will say, when I am looking at like the 0 to 60, 60 to 120, 120 to 180, those are all general recommendations. Newman's textbook talks about it a lot, those specific ranges. And I think honestly, the 0 to 60 and those ranges, they're really specific when it gets to shoulder flexion and scapulohumeral rhythm. But within the pelvis, like I said, we don't have 180 degrees of hip flexion. So essentially I really think about the hip flexion. We can get into more of this later. I just want you guys to have a basic understanding. I think we get into more expansion past about 100-ish degrees of hip flexion. But as long as you guys have the basic understanding and you get more reps in with your clients, you'll see these things too. That's why I'm not too worried, but yes. Right here. You guys have any questions on that? Hopefully the examples of using a neutral grip dumbbell bench press for someone who's compressed makes sense. Just for another example, going back to that narrow who has like really hard time not rounding their low back. If you elevate their toes and bias them towards dorsiflexion, oftentimes that helps them find more pelvic compression. Regarding the squat in the limb arc model, without a load, a person can get asked to grasp, but with load, the squat only goes to 90. What might be an explanation for this? So I've seen that a couple of times. I think what's going on there, it was usually with people who lift weights a lot, people who are like power lifters. And in my experience, those people are just used to stopping at 90 degrees. And it also depends where the load is, right? So if it's a posterior load, that's going to bias them towards more of a hingy squat. If it's an anterior load, it's going to bias them towards more of a full depth squat. So I think it depends on the placement of the load, and it also depends on what they're used to doing in training itself. Anything else? These are all good questions. I like these. Butt wink at the bottom of a squat. Is this a pelvis that doesn't have counter nutation at full depth, so access lumbar flexion instead? Yeah, usually that's what you see, right? So I'll just do it right now. Watch me squat. Watch this absolutely garbage bodyweight squat. Okay, here, right here, and then boom. You see what happened right there? That is my squat. I'm very compressed. I'm very wide. So I'm here, and this is I'm exaggerating this. So I'm going down, 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 can't get there. Ooh, I need to go into counter nutation now. So I just roll it back under. And that's the only way I know how to get more depth without a heel lift. Is the PowerPoint on Slack or website login? It'll be on both. Are the functions in this slide flexion, abduction, plantar flexion, referring to global mechanics or one part of the body in particular? So I like to think about it just feeding down the chain as a whole. So think about the pelvis in a squat. If we're in flexion, abduction, external rotation, that's going to bias the femurs towards more external rotation, which then feeds down the chain into supination, tibial external rotation, supination, and then vice versa for the exhalation compression. So I think it does feed down the chain. Thank you, Kevin. Wait, can you do your squat again? Ah, yes. So I try to find, I'm good. Ooh, right here. This is when I'm out of room. I feel it within my body. I have to then do that. That was the point where I needed to start to find that counter nutation. But because I'm already hingy to begin with, it's really hard for me to do that. But the limb arc model slide is referring to gait. Sorry, a little confused. No, I think these are good questions. I'm sure other people have these too. So we will get into how this relates to gait a lot more next week. But think about it like this. So forget this part of it right here, because I can see how that would be confusing. When we are in heel strike, that is a external rotation, abduction, plantar flexion, supination bias within our pelvis and lower extremity. When we're in mid stance, it's those joint actions. When we're in late stance, it's those joint actions again. So heel strike is ER, mid stance is IR, late stance is ER. That's how it relates. But it's also relating to the degrees of hip flexion too. So it works both ways. Any other questions? This is good stuff. Next week, we're going to talk all about gait, and we're going to talk all about asymmetry of the pelvis. It'll be a good one. It'll be a long one, but be ready for that. In late stance, we come back to flexion. So late stance, let me break out the pellet model. Where did I put it? Oh, there it is. Okay. I think they might be a little bit confused on how that relates to squats. So, okay, so let's break this down. So heel strike, we're out here. Pelvis, forward foot on the left side, we strike the ground, we're in external rotation. As we go into mid stance, pay attention to this side of the pelvis, internal rotation. As we go back, as we push off again, we're then going to have to go into relative amounts of external rotation. So it's all relative within the pelvis and what the other side is doing. In squats, it goes like this. We start here, we go down from 0 to 60, 60 to 120, maximized at 90, and then beyond about, just say 120 to 180, we're back here. So if you guys go and look at like really high level Olympic weightlifters, they're ass to grass and they're nice flat back because of the counter nutation in a full depth squat. Can you apply the limb arc model to a stiff leg deadlift? So I'm assuming that's just bilateral. So that's just like doing a deadlift in general. What you're going to do is you're going to start off nice and tall, and then you're going to go into 90-ish degrees of hip flexion. So due to that pelvic position, you will have to compress and find internal rotation, adduction and extension, and relative amounts of counter nutation or nutation within your sacrum. So it's all depending on what's your pelvis doing in space. Just because it's stiff leg doesn't mean it's still not a hinge where you have to compress. Heel strike adductors, anterior glute medial fibers concentrically oriented. So would that be internal rotation? That would be the pelvis moving over the femur into acetabular femoral internal rotation, because remember, our foot is fixed on the ground when we're moving over it. So our pelvis is going to move over it like so, and that's going to, yes, I call that internal rotation. Can you review how sacral and pelvic movement differ between hip hinges and squats? Yes. So let's do squat first. Remember 0 to 60, external rotation, abduction and flexion, sacral counter nutation. And then as we get towards 90 degrees, it's going to go into that compression, nutation, internal rotation, adduction, and extension. Then as we get towards the bottom of the squat, we reaccess that expansion mechanic. In a hinge, you start up nice and tall, or if you're starting from the floor in a deadlift, you're starting in nutation and compression. So then you're coming up and then you're finishing in relative amounts of flexion, abduction, external rotation within the pelvis, and that counter-nutated sacrum. As you go back down again, you're going to go into that hinge and compression. Any other questions? All good stuff. I think as we talk about gait next week, that'll really help you guys understand a lot more of this stuff. Will we be having access to the webinars? Yes. This whole thing is going to be up on the website right after this, as soon as it's done uploading and converting. So you should be in a small group. If you're not, I haven't seen your Google form entry, and you can just message me with what time zone you're in. That'd probably just be the easiest way of doing it. So if you're not in a small group, just shoot me a message on Slack directly. Say, hey, I'm not in one. This is my time zone, and I'll throw you in one. Thank you, Amy. Anything else, guys? So I would just encourage you guys in small groups, just have a discussion about this stuff, teach each other some 90-90 hip lifts, and just review the study guide as well. Thank you, guys. All right. If there's no other questions, I'm going to call it there. Have a good rest of your day, guys. I will see you in the review session, hopefully.